Hello, everyone. This is the 206th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English author Mr. David AJ Reynolds as we discuss the Hungary national team in the 1978 World Cup. Welcome back, David.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so last time we left off at the end of the 1966 World Cup. So, can you present the state of Hungarian football in the late 1960s into the 1970s in social and cultural terms as well?
Hmm. Well, one of the main burdens I think that I had when we talked about the 1966 World Cup team, I guess it's a few years ago now, was really to use that team as a demonstration of the fact that 1956 wasn't a dead end for Hungarian football, as is often said. It is a very popular myth, both inside Hungary and outside of Hungary, that 1956 sort of ends Hungary's footballing greatness. And I don't think that's true. And I think the strength of the 1966 team is a demonstration of both the continuity of Hungarian football before and after 1956 and its ability to reproduce itself very strongly after 1956. And that continues. I think the strength of Hungarian football that we see in 66, or that's demonstrated in 66 in the World Cup, continues after it. In 1968, Hungary wins the gold medal at the Olympics again for the second Olympics in a row. Even though in 1970 they failed to qualify for the World Cup, that's not really seen as obviously it's a huge disappointment, but it's not seen as an indicative moment or as a demonstration of some sort of terrible weakening. Really, Hungary is very unlucky not to qualify for the World Cup in 1970. Had their group been decided either according to goal difference or according to head-to-head record, which it would have been in most other World Cup qualifying groups since, they would have been in the 1970 World Cup. But they're level on points with Czechoslovakia, and instead of giving them the advantage of goal difference or of head-to-head record, there's an extra one-game playoff between the two in Marseille, which Hungary loses, and that's why they're not in the 1970 World Cup. But then even after that, 1972, Hungary wins a silver medal in the Olympics in 1972, and then perhaps even more significantly, in 72, they make the semi-finals of the European Championships. So, in other words, we see Hungary competing strongly in the late 60s and early 70s, both as the national team and club teams as well. We see a Hungarian team in the semi-final of the European Cup in 74. Ferencváros get to the final of the Conference Cup. So there's good evidence for Hungarian, as I say, continuity. However, 1974 is a break. I think we can talk about 1974, which is sort of the beginning of the cycle we're going to talk about today, as a turning point. And it's a turning point for a few different reasons. The first, of course, is in late 73, they failed to qualify for the 1974 World Cup. And that's really a different moment from the failure to qualify in 1970. Of course, it's a second failure in a row, which brings its own sense of not just disappointment, but of crisis. But it's also seen as not unlucky or unfortunate, but representative of something bad which is happening. And the reaction that you see in Hungary to the failure to qualify for the 1974 World Cup is we've been left behind. And the other big footballing nations who have been competitive with, in some sense, for about 40 years, if you take it back to the 1938 World Cup final, these countries that we've been competitive with, and in some cases we've been better than and have learned from us, that they've now overtaken us and we're now behind. And it's interesting that the two elements that are consistently identified as lacking in Hungarian football that is causing this deficit is stamina and speed. Those are the two things that are continually emphasized. The Hungarian teams, and of course, they're particularly about the Hungarian national team, that in these games against international opponents, by the way, they failed to qualify in for the 74 World Cup at the hands of mostly Sweden and Austria. So good teams, but not teams that you would say these are the best teams in the world. When they look at what's the difference here? What is the reason why we're coming up short against these teams? Those are the things that they are identifying, that we're not able to continue the intense effort through the 90 minutes in the way that other players or other teams are being able to do. And speed in both sense, not just in terms of running speed, but also speed of movement. That these other teams are quicker than us and they last longer than us. And so what you get in the beginning of 1974 is a fundamental reorganization of Hungarian football from top to bottom. With this failure and the need to correct this failure as not just the number one cause of the reorganization, but correcting it being the number one goal to the reorganization. So that the national team is regarded not just as the pinnacle of what the Hungarian football authorities are trying to do, but it's regarded as in some ways, the purpose of the whole structure, which isn't always the case, is it? You see sometimes national teams being seen as a bit of an afterthought sometimes, or at least a peripheral thing to the national game.
Yeah,
Now, of course, there's
that's what I
good.
learned when I recently did a podcast on East Germany, and that's exactly how they viewed the national team.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And the East German parallel is an interesting one as well, because one of the things that makes that attitude both possible and more likely is the fact that the national team is integrated and the National Football Association is integrated into the state structure in a way that would seem extraordinary in other situations. So the reorganization that happens of Hungarian football in 1974 is something that's happening in a way that makes it clear that the Football Association and the national team is well, to put it crudely, it's an arm of the state. It's not sort of a separate social organization that represents the nation. It's an arm of the state. So there's a new sporting authority or a reworked sporting authority that's introduced in 1974, and the Hungarian Football Association comes under their authority,
Yeah.
right? So for
Sorry,
example,
David. In our
yeah,
last conversation, I seem to remember you said like after 1956, it was
yeah,
decided that the clubs would have some discretion and they would not be under the control of the
yeah.
state. So now they're reverting back to that, it seems like.
Yeah, it's a really good point. They're sort of semi-reverting back. So the clubs, it is still the case that I would say there's two things to say about that. One is it's still the case after 1956, by the time we get to the 70s, that the clubs are not pawns of the state in the way that they were in that brief sort of Stalinist period of the early 50s. But they usually come under the authority of a particular group that has connections to the state, either because they are themselves a part of the state. So, for example, the police or the Department of Defense, or because they're a business. And of course, if you're a business at this time in Hungary, you still need connections with the state. So the clubs aren't pawns of the state in the way that they had been in the past. However, the national team, when the authorities look at the failures of the Hungarian national team in the early 70s, one of the things they're thinking is we need this to be organized centrally again, the national team particularly. So in some ways, it is a reversion in the sense that when they look back and they see somebody like Gustav Sebeş, his authority as the Hungarian national team manager in the great era of Hungarian football in the 50s is partly enabled for the fact that he is part of the state apparatus. He has an official position within the party state and has authority as a result of that over sporting things that go outside of the actual selection of the team. So it is a semi-reversion in that sense of saying, well, this needs to be organized from top to bottom in a way that is very coordinated on a state level. However, the part that isn't a reversion to the situation in the 50s is it's not political, or we should say it's not ideological. So, what the Hungarian national football team is kind of embroiled in the early 50s is sort of a propaganda purpose in the sense that their value to the party state is demonstrating the superiority of communist ideology and communist practice. That's not really going on in the 1970s in Hungary, not in this or in any other area. So it's drawn into the party state as as in a bureaucratic way, in a way that, well, we need to organize this in a coordinated fashion so that it's as good as it could possibly can be. But there's not an ideological element to it. It's not a propaganda exercise in that sense. So in 1974, the reorganization that they do has a few different elements. One element is the employment and payment of the players by their clubs is regularized and professionalized in a way that it hadn't been before. So there was a lot of there was really an informal system of bonuses and extra payments that players would make their living out of that would come through the discretion of the group that organized and owned the individual club. And the Hungarian FA say, well, we can't have this anymore. We need this to be regularized and we need this to be professionalized. And we need players to be clear about what they're getting paid when they're getting paid. So that's one element. But the part that's going to be relevant, particularly for our discussion today, is that they introduce a whole new set of physical requirements that every player in every professional club in Hungary has to fulfill. So again, remember what's the diagnosis? The diagnosis is stamina and speed. That's why we're lagging behind the other countries. So how are we going to correct this? So the new president of the Hungarian FA, a guy called István Kutas, he introduces these regulations, and it's saying every week on a Monday and Tuesday, what every professional football in Hungary, first division, second division, third division, has to do. So, for example, every 2 weeks they have to do 3,000 meters in 30-meter increments, 100 times 30-meter run. Every other week, that's on a Monday, every other week. On a Tuesday, they have to do a 2,000-meter run. And the intervening Monday, they have to do a 12-minute run of minimum of 3,000 meters continuously. So they've got these very, very specific physical stipulations that they're introducing. And they send inspectors around. The Hungarian FA sends inspectors around to all of the different clubs, making sure they're doing this. This is what the main way, or one of the main ways they're trying to remedy what they see as a stamina deficit,
But in a
Hungarian
way, they're
footballers.
taking away authority from the managers of these
Yes,
individual teams.
yes, that's a really good point, and it was received that way. It was felt that way. A lot of the individual coaches felt exactly as you say that their authority has been taken away because here's somebody else with a clipboard and he can tell me what to do, even though this is my club. Yeah, that's right. And it's a very controversial change, by the way. And so a lot of people now looking back say, well, this was a disastrous thing and it tired people out and it didn't help. And that's a discussion for another day, whether or not this was a good change. But absolutely, as you say, it's undermining the individual managers in a way that creates resentment and creates problems. But the person who's put in charge of the coaching department of the Hungarian FA at this moment is Lajos Barotti, who we're going to talk about much more soon. Up to this point, he'd been the manager of Újpest. Of course, we saw him in 1966. He was the manager of Hungary in 1966 and in 62. In the intervening time, he had managed in Hungary. He'd also managed abroad. He'd managed in Peru, the Peruvian national team. But in the early 70s, he's back at Utrecht and winning championships at Utrecht. And he steps back in 74 and is appointed to oversee this coaching position over all of Hungarian football for the Hungarian FA. And the choice for national manager in this moment is really significant because at this moment where there's a new leader of the Hungarian FA saying we've got to professionalize, we've got to get serious, we've got to get fitter, we've got to, our players have got to take things more seriously. The person that they choose to be the national team manager is Josef Bojic. In some ways, it's a surprising choice. So, of course, Bojic is one of the great players, not just of Hungarian football history, but of all football history, part of that great team of the early 50s, legend of Kispest football. But he had only been a manager of a team for about just over a year, just over a season in 66 and 67. So why is he being tapped by Kutash to be the national team coach at this moment? Well, one of the things that defined his period of time as the Honved coach in 66, 67 was his attempt to do the same thing. His attempt to try and drag the players out of what he saw was their sort of sloppy habits and try and make them more professional and fitter. And one of the things that he introduced was that the players had to be at training the whole day. So it's normal for footballers both then and now that training's really half a day thing. You go home at lunch. And he insisted that his players stayed at training all afternoon, which you can imagine how popular that was amongst most of the players. But this is one of the reasons why Kutash thinks, okay, Bozic's the man for this moment because we're on the same wavelength when it comes to the need for players to take their football more seriously, to be more professional in their habits, and to be fitter. Now, of course, this doesn't last long, unfortunately, because Bojic has a heart attack after his first few days after his first match in charge of the national team, and he's not able to continue as manager. And there's a few games where there's a caretaker manager, but then in 75, the person who's then given the job on a permanent basis is, of course, Boratti again. So he's put back in charge of the national team. And so the whole atmosphere in which this World Cup cycle is going on in Hungary is an atmosphere of there's a crisis in Hungarian football. We're getting left behind and we're trying to fix it. And we're changing the way we organize everything to try and fix it. And the barometer of whether we're doing a good job here, and this is explicitly stated, it's not just an implicit idea. The explicitly stated barometer is if we qualify for the 78 World Cup, then what we're doing is on the right track. So there's a huge amount of pressure, in other words, on Boratti and on the team to qualify for the 78 World Cup.
Let's look at some of the players of this 78 generation. We have the likes of Laszlo Fazekas, Tibor Nilasi,
Mm.
Andras Torocic. What can you say about their career trajectory at this point as we come to the mid to late 1970s?
You've named the three most important attacking players there. I mean, Fazekas and Torocic are both key parts of the Újpest team, which at this point in the 70s, Újpest is the best team in Hungary. They win the championship for the majority of the seasons of the 1970s. Fazekas is an older player than Torocic. Torocic is sort of the newer star, and he is a star. He's already had some problems, some disciplinary problems. So Turicic is brought into the team in 76, the national team, I should say, in 76 and 77. Boratti takes the Hungary national team on a South American tour as a way to sort of prepare the team for the World Cup. It's the same thing he had done before the World Cup in Chile in 62. Turicic and another player called Ebedli are caught trying to smuggle things into the country when they re-enter Hungary at the end of the tour. The tour's in the early 1977. By the way, this was pretty standard practice in those days, both for national team players to bring in prohibited goods, and it was standard practice for the authorities to look the other way. But for some reason, they don't for Turchik and Abedley. They're caught bringing things in at customs, and he's banned from the national team as a result. So just as he's really getting his feet wet as a national team player at the beginning of 77, he's then excluded for a number of matches as a discipline for this event. And for most of the qualification for the World Cup, he's not in the team. But then he's brought back into the team for the playoffs. And he really reestablishes himself as a key player. He's a very silky, skillful ball handler. He's an exciting player. He's the young star of Újpest at this point. Fazekas is an older player. He's a more established player. He's also a different type of player as well. He's not the person that you would expect to be dribbling on the ball, which is a sort of thing that Turicic would be known for, his silkiness on the ball. Nyilasi is a Ferencváros player and is more of a midfield playmaker, certainly also an attacking midfielder, but more of a playmaker. But again, by this time, very much established at the heart of both the national team and the Ferencváros team. If you were to name the most important Hungarian attacking players, you would name those three, and you probably would also add Varadi, who played for Vasas, and he had really established himself by this time as an essential player in the national team, on sort of on the left wing, on the left side of an attacking three. And as we'll see later, if Varadi and Turicic and Nyilasi are essential attacking players, and Fazekas, this is one of the reasons we'll see later for why things went wrong in the World Cup.
And as far as the qualifiers, they're in a group with the Soviet Union and Greece.
Yes,
And I imagine the Soviet Union would have probably been looked upon as the favorites, but
yes,
of course, it would be Hungary who would win this group. So
yes.
that's a major achievement after two failures in the previous two World Cup cycles.
It's a major. You're right. It's a major achievement, and it's a major football achievement, and I must say it's also a major sort of psychological achievement, if that
Of
makes
course,
sense.
yeah, yeah.
The Soviet Union is a really a bogey team for Hungary. I think by the time they meet in the qualifiers, they'd played 14 times and won only twice. And they'd lost some big matches against the Soviet Union, like the 66 quarterfinal that we spoke about before. And of course, there's the Soviet Union, of course, politically, it is the country that has militarily put down a new Hungarian regime in 1956. It's militarily occupying the country, and Hungary just seemed to always play badly against the Soviet Union. So not only is it probably pound for pound a better team, and as you say, certainly the favourite going into the qualification group, but it's also a real hurdle to get over just playing this team for the Hungarian team. So when they beat them at home in their second qualification match. It's a huge deal. The players who played in that game, it's one of the highlights of their career to win that game.
After that, they had to have a playoff against a South American nation. And in late 1977, they had to play a home and away series against Bolivia. And
Yes,
at home, they demolished Bolivia 6-0. And away from home at La Paz, at the altitude, they won 3-2. So
yes.
these were two convincing wins. And I imagine there would have been a feeling of a rebirth at this point, having qualified to the World Cup.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I mean the qualification for the 78 World Cup as probably some of your listeners already know is a little bit idiosyncratic. There's only 16 teams in the 78 tournament. The European qualification is organized, of course, West Germany are automatically participants as holders. And then there's nine UEFA qualifying groups of three, or there's some four as well, but most of them are three. Eight winners go directly into the tournament, and the ninth best winner of the group out of those nine group winners has to be in a playoff. And Hungary just happens to be the ninth best in terms of points and goal difference. France has the same amount of points, but a better goal difference. But then the even stranger, I think, is the South American qualification, where there's three groups of three, and the top of each of those teams then played each other in a three-team playoff. And the top two teams in that three-team playoff went straight to the World Cup, and the third then had to play the ninth best group winner. So that's Hungary, Bolivia. So I mentioned that to say, well, this is kind of rather convoluted route to this playoff. And you're right that it's a confidence booster, but it's a dubious one for a few different reasons. Because this is very, very strange things going on with Bolivia that undermine the value of the victory. So Bolivia win their group of three, but then when they play in this three-team tournament with Brazil and Peru, the other two group winners, they lose 8-0 to Brazil and they lose 5-0 to Peru. And at that point, they sack their coach. And so they're looking for a new coach for this playoff against Hungary. And this is something, by the way, that one of your listeners needs to go away and spend 3 years researching this fellow and write a book about it, because I want to read this book. They hire this person called Edward Virba. And he's a really strange character. He's one of these sort of footballing entrepreneurs that you read about in the 20s and 30s, but this is the 1970s, it's really hard to get to the truth out of this person, partly because of the obscurity of what he does, and partly because he's constantly trying to sort of obfuscate his own past. So if you look at the reports of this Hungary-Bolivia game, the first leg, this new coach, he's always described as a German coach, Edward Virba, the German coach. He's not German, but he has sort of popped up all around the world. And he seems to be one of these persons who sort of overpromises and then underdelivers and then moves on to a place where they don't know about what he did before. So he's actually a Lithuanian man. Him and his mum ended up in Germany in 1944, 1945. He's in a DP camp, a displaced persons camp in Germany for 5 years, while his mum tries to emigrate with herself and her son. Succeeds in emigrating to Australia. So he emigrates with his mum to Australia when he's 15. He gets into football or continues in football in Australia. You see him popping up in Australian teams in the late 50s. Gets banned for life for attacking a referee as a player. That ban for life is rescinded. And then you suddenly find him popping up in Europe. He plays 4 games in the Turkish league in the 1960s. You then see him playing in the United States. You then see him popping up and playing in Canada. So he has this extraordinary playing career. I think he plays in Switzerland as well for a little bit. And then he does the same thing as a manager. He had managed a little bit in Bolivia, but earlier on, at another point in the late 70s, he's the manager of the Zambian national team for 2.5 months. Does badly and then leaves, is never seen or heard of again. But he manages to persuade in this period of disaster for the Bolivian team. They've just lost 5-0 and 8-0. In this period of disaster, he manages to persuade the Bolivian FA that he's an expert in European football. I see no reason, actual reality, to suggest that he was an expert in European football, but he persuades them of this and clearly tells them he's a German citizen, which he isn't. But so he gets the job. He says to them, "Oh, your days of being thrashed are over, but you have to send me over to Germany for a 1 month training camp before the match." So he comes over, they're in Germany for weeks before the Hungary game. He arrives in Hungary with his team and then just behaves in this really, really bizarre way. So he tells all his players when they arrive at the airport to hide their faces from the cameraman so they can't take pictures of them. They give false names for themselves when reporters ask the players who they are. They tell them fake names, again, apparently under his instruction. On the day of the match, he posts a fake team sheet an hour before the game with the wrong names and the wrong. So it really bizarre. You think, well, maybe he's some kind of At this point, you could say, well, he's a strange fellow, but maybe he's a genius. But then the team is a mess. I mean, it's 5-0 at half time in that first leg. So 6-0 may have flattered the Bolivian team in that game. And he doesn't go back with the team to Bolivia and then is sacked in his absence. So that's his one game in charge. I say that just because it's sort of an interesting story. Now, as I say, I would love somebody to do more research on this chap because he's so intriguing. But I also say that because I don't know how much we can read into that 6-0 win, whether it's a victory against in the moment. Don't get me wrong, in the moment it's incredibly exciting. It is what you suggest. It's a boost to the morale. We're pretty good. We beat the third best team in South America 6-0. But this is a team that's just lost 8-0 and 5-0 in their previous two games, and it's a team that's being run by a very erratic, strange person who's probably not qualified to do the job. So the second leg back in Bolivia is perhaps more impressive because it's notoriously difficult to play away in Bolivia because of the altitude. And so Hungary's 3-2 win in the second leg is perhaps more impressive than the 6-0 win they have in the first leg. But by the way, again, this is where we see Turicic back in the team, these two games, where he's sort of re-establishing himself as a first choice player, which he hadn't been in the qualifiers up to this point.
Well, Barotti had stated that he wanted his team to be faster than the Brazilians and more technical than the Dutch. Bold claims indeed. But following the qualification, what were the preparations like after such a long absence from a World Cup?
Yeah, this is a really irrelevant question because the preparations in the end became a huge point of contention. When people, after the failure in the World Cup, were trying to identify the preparations for a lot of people were one of the major culprits. And you might think, oh, does that mean the preparations were not serious enough? Well, it's actually the opposite. So again, remember, as I said before, the Hungarian FA are micromanaging the game in a bureaucratic sense, not an ideological sense, but bureaucratic sense, with the national team as the explicit purpose of all of this. So they organized the 77-78 season with this in mind. And there's a long winter break in Hungary, as there are in a lot of countries in this region. So usually you play the first half of the season starting a little bit earlier than you would in Western Europe. You start in late July, finish early December at the halfway point, restart in February, do the second half sort of February to May. Well, the Hungarian FA organised the 77-78 season so that more than half was done, more than half of the fixtures were played in the first half before the winter break, so that after the winter break, they only needed to play February to April. So they played Wednesday, Saturday, or so Wednesday, Sunday, sorry, Wednesday,
Right,
Sunday,
that's right. They had like a schedule of two matches per week
two matches
constantly.
per
Yeah.
week.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was also really an intent that two matches every week was also really a deliberate response to the idea, well, these players are lacking in stamina. So we need to really build up their stamina. And they're thinking, well, we get to the World Cup, we're playing three games in 10 days. They just need to be used to playing games every 3 days. It needs to be absolutely ingrained in them. And so they play two games a week, February to April. So the season's over by mid-April. So now there's a long period now, 6 weeks, a little bit over 6 weeks until the World Cup. And what they do basically is they have the national team in training camp for almost the entire intervening period. So you've got this very, very strict schedule, intensive schedule, and then you've got this long period of not just match inactivity, but confinement, sometimes literally. So first, they have a 3-week training camp in Budapest first, where they're with each other every day. The players who are based in Pest can go home at the end of the day. The players who aren't based in Pest just have to stay in accommodation together. And then at the end of that 3 week period, they go to Germany. And there's another training camp of nearly 2 weeks. And this is the point, I think, where things really start to go wrong with the preparation because Barotti had intended this 2 week period in Germany, or nearly 2 weeks in Germany, to consist of a series. He wanted to have four practice matches against different German teams. And he had arranged with an old friend of his who had been the manager at Schalke, Österreicher, to organize this for him. Unfortunately, Österreicher was fired by Schalke before he could make the arrangements. So they're still going to Germany. They're staying courtesy of Adi Dassler, the founder and owner of Adidas. He's putting them up on his facilities in Germany. That's why they're going to Germany originally. Adi Dassler and István Kutas, the Hungarian FA president, were friends. And so Adidas is putting them up and providing them with facilities in Germany. But they're supposed to be playing matches. They don't have any training matches because of this situation. So they've been cooped up, a lot of them, for 3 weeks in Budapest, not really playing matches, just training. Then they have this 2 weeks in Germany, or nearly 2 weeks in Germany, again, where they're confined. The rules are quite strict. Family's not there, wives are not there. It's quite strict and disciplined, and this is also Kutas's way of doing things. So the players are really chafing under these restrictions. They're feeling cooped up as you would after nearly 5 weeks, just with a group, and they're not playing matches, which had been part of the idea. And one of the only matches that they play of any kind is a mini match, just two halves of 25 minutes against a Tunisian team on Adidas's new AstroTurf. So Adidas has a new AstroTurf there near their headquarters, and they want to sort of promote it a little bit and have it tested out. So the Hungarian team and the Tunisian team play a little mini match on this AstroTurf, and this is May the 16th. And one of the reasons why this is a moment that people focus on is Varadi gets injured playing on this AstroTurf. Whether the AstroTurf has got anything to do with it is a matter of debate, but they hadn't played on AstroTurf before. And of course, it's a very different surface in terms of what it does to your muscles or how your muscles respond to it. And he tears a muscle in his thigh, Varadi, during this match. So in this preparation period, I would say there's sort of three things that I look back on it later as being detrimental to the performance. One is just being cooped up in strict sort of boarding school situation for 5 weeks where the team just got cabin fever and just got tired and annoyed and cranky. Think England fans will think of similar stories about the English team under Capello in the 2010 World Cup, same sort of thing, that it just in the end had a negative effect because people just got very annoyed. And the fact that they just get completely out of match fitness. So this preparation period, which isn't amateurish. Sometimes you say, oh, it's amateur. It wasn't amateurish. It was very organized, but just things went wrong, and so, which meant that they weren't playing matches. And so they go from being very, very match fit in this spring season to being completely match idle for 5 weeks. And then, of course, the loss of Varadi for the World Cup is huge. He's a key part of the team. And it's also key that his injury is either not properly diagnosed or the proper diagnosis is swept on the carpet, which is true, I'm not quite sure. But they take him anyway to the World Cup. And that also turns out to be quite important because Barotti doesn't want to take his full complement of 22. He says, well, if you take 22 players, you get four or five players who are just discontent and they sour the camp. So he just took 18, I think, with him. And one of them is Varadi, who is unfit and doesn't play any of the games. And the cherry on the top of this really rather unfortunate 5 weeks of idleness is not quite right because they're training, but sort of frustration and match idleness and injury The cherry on top is right at the end of this, right before they're about to travel to Argentina, they then play a match against England. And this is also a very, it's looked back on as another element in what made this a bad preparation because they go into this match, whatever the opposite of sharp is in terms of being ready for a big match. And they are absolutely demolished by England in this match. And you can see the reason for organizing this fixture. I don't think there's any reason to criticize the organization of it. Some people do. I think this was just a bad idea organizing this fixture. But in the circumstance, it turns out really to be the worst sort of preparation because it's really a confidence blow. It's a huge blow to the morale.
Not to mention all the controversy regarding Torochik's girlfriend's shoplifting there. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a yeah, exactly. So there's the one element is the match itself, which is a disaster beyond the 4-1 scoreline. I mean, they're completely outplayed in the match. I think what is a real confidence blow to the team is not just that they lose 4-1, but they just are never in this game. England surprised them. This is Ron Greenwood's England. Ron Greenwood is a very underrated manager. He plays a 4-2-4 formation in this game. And England's front four, including Keegan, Trevor Francis, Steve Coppell, completely overwhelm Hungary's defence. They don't quite know who to cover in this circumstance, and they just can't lay a glove on them. And the midfield have to sort of come back to try and cope with this. It's a very, very poor performance. So that really, and players, Barotti talked about this, and players talked about this as a real psychological scar, this performance and the way that they were outplayed. But then, as you mentioned, this is on the 24th, this England game. So this is a Wednesday, I believe. The 24th would be a Wednesday. So they go back again to Germany after the game. They're going to play Sochaux of France in their final sort of practice match before they fly. Now, Barotti had made it very, very clear, and this was something he had the support of the Hungarian FA on, no wives. Because he said, listen, we've had an experience before at previous World Cups where the wives really created a problem. They created a problem in terms of team morale. They created a problem in terms of team discipline and team focus. Whether or not that's true I'm not commenting on, but that was the perception that Borutti had and the people in the Hungarian FA had. So they said no wives on any of these trips, not to the camps, not to England, not to the World Cup. Well, three of the wives, actually two wives and one fiance or girlfriend, as you say. So Fazekas, his wife, Josef Todt, his wife, and then Torochik's, I think she was his fiance at the time, but perhaps just his girlfriend. They organized their own trip. So not through the FA. So they're not brought out by the FA. They organized their own trip to come to London at the same time the team's at London. Now, this creates a huge problem. These are all Újpest players, these three players. And the feeling is, oh, I see. It's one rule for the Újpest players. It's a different rule for everybody else. So Újpest players, their wives get to come over. My wife has to stay at home. So this creates a bit of a split in the team right here. There's a sense of there's an Újpest clique. Remember, this is the top team in the country at this time, and they're in a different category to everybody else. So this creates a problem already. But then when they go back to Germany after the game, there's reports, oh, they haven't got back to Hungary yet. What's going on? Why haven't they got back to Hungary yet? So they find out by phone 2 days later. And I think the incident happens after the game, maybe on the 25th. It certainly happens after the Hungary team have left England, that Fazekas' wife and Tudorcik's girlfriend are caught shoplifting in London. Just one t-shirt and one bra. So it's not like they were shoplifting jewels or something of huge value. I think the total value of the two things they stole came to less than £7. Nevertheless, they're caught. They set off an alarm. They're caught. They're arrested and they have a court appearance on the Friday, on the 26th. So Fazekas hears about it by phone, Turicic hears about it by phone, told. On the 26th, they have this court appearance. They're given a conditional discharge, but the court appearance makes the press in England. Now, we should say it doesn't make the press in Hungary, as you would expect. This is not going to be in the papers in Hungary. So it's not in the papers in Hungary, and not at all, as far as I can tell, anyway. The other players at this point, I don't think know about it either. Turkic Fazikas talk to know about it, obviously, because it's their wives and significant others who've been impacted. And I think at this point, the other team members don't know about it either. But it hits the press in England. It's in all of the papers in England. Hungarian players' wives are shoplifters and thieves. It's a big story. And so, of course, they're in Western Europe, remember, at this time, preparing for the World Cup. They're not back in Hungary, they're in Western Europe. So the news stories in England come to their attention. So they see what the press is writing about it in England. And this is what makes it such a big deal because Fazekas particularly is devastated by this and humiliated by this. I think, as you can understand, he's the captain of the team. Again, it's already a big deal that she's there. It's already controversial that she was in London. Most people think she shouldn't have been there in the first place. People are already angry at Fazekas that his wife was there, created problems in the team. Now this has happened. It's a complete humiliation. Add this to the fact that in the game at Wembley, he started, he was the captain, he played very badly. He was substituted at half time, completely ineffective. So after the story breaks of his wife's arrest in London, he goes to Barotti and he says, I can't be the captain of the team anymore. You have to take the captaincy away from me. So the psychological blow of this just really comprehensive defeat at Wembley is then followed immediately by this whole different problem where the team captain is resigning less than a week before the beginning of the World Cup. He's also completely shorn of confidence, and now Barotti has to install a new captain. But this is also a problem because Barotti wants to appoint Sándor Pinter, a great midfield player, Honvéd Kispest player. He wants to appoint Pinter as his new captain. Great choice for a captain. I mean, you couldn't find a player who works harder in a game than Pinter. Terrific player. Kutas, president of the Hungarian FA, overrules him, vetoes him. And we don't really know why. I don't know why anyway. Maybe somebody knows why. Kutas was very had information other people wouldn't have had. So whether he's got some political reason not to want Pinter as captain, perhaps that's the case. I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But Kutas overrules Barotti and insists on Zoltán Kereki instead. Now, Zoltán Kereki was centre back, had been a key part of the qualification. It's not that Kereki was a bad choice as captain. He certainly wasn't. But everybody expected Pinter to be given the captaincy, including Pinter. And so this is another problem in the team right before the World Cup's about to start. Is Pinter feels completely blindsided, humiliated is perhaps too strong a word, but certainly shocked. He expected to get it, he didn't get it, and everybody else expected him to get it as well. So it's not quite true to say that everything that could have gone wrong did go wrong in this sort of 6 week preparation period, but there's a lot of things that ended up being extremely unhelpful. I think it's fair to say.
And all in all, Hungary only played two preparation friendlies. On April 15th, they defeated Czechoslovakia at Budapest. And on May 24th, there's that heavy loss against England. So they departed under the worst possible conditions for their confidence.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely, and that's the thing. I mean, I think you can make a case that physically that period of match inactivity was really bad for them, but I think the psychological element is perhaps more significant.
So let's look at the final 22 selected by Lajos Barotti. As goalkeepers at number one, we have Sandor Gujdar of Honved. At number 21, Ferenc Mejaros of Vasas. And at number 22, Lajlo Kovacs of Videoton. Defenders, number two, we have Peter Torok of Vasas. Number three, Isvan Košić of Honved. Number four, Josef Toth of Újpest. Number six, the new captain, Zoltán Kereki of Haladas. Number 12, Gyozo Martos of Ferencváros. Number 14, Lajlo Balint of Ferencváros. And number 15, Tibor Rap of Ferencváros. As midfielders, number 5, we have Sandor Zombori of Vasas. Number 8, Tibor Nilasi of Ferencváros. Number 10, Sandor Pinter of Honved. Number 13, Karoli Zsapo of Tatabánya. Number 16, Istvan Halaj of Tatabánya. Number 18, Lajlo Nagy of Újpest. And number 20, Ferenc Pulop of MTK. As strikers, number 7, Lajlo Fizikas of Újpest. Number 9, Andras Torocik of Újpest. Number 11, Bella Varadi of Vasas, who was injured, as you mentioned. Number 17, Lajlo Pushtai of Ferencváros. And number 19, Andras Toth of Újpest. And for the World Cup, Hungary were in the group with the hosts Argentina, Italy, and France. So it was a very balanced group. That, and the first match was against the World Cup host Argentina, who would eventually go on and win the World Cup. And the familiar faces, of course, we know them all. Captain Daniel Passarella, Mario Kempes, Daniel Bertoni, Ardiles, among others. This first match against Argentina was on June 2nd, 1978 at Buenos Aires at El Monumental. For this match, we have the following lineup. Gujdar Torok, he'd be replaced by Martos in the 46th minute. Kočić, Toth, Zombori, Kereki, Pinter, Zsapo, Neji, Nilashi, and Torocik. This match, Hungary actually takes the lead in the 10th minute. Zombori's shot was parried by Ubaldo Filiol and Zsapo knocks in the rebound. However, Argentina ties the match just 5 minutes later. Kempes' indirect free kick was parried by Gujdar and Leopoldo Luque knocked in the rebound. Nilashi would be booked in the 21st minute. In the 48th minute, Torocek would also be booked for throwing the ball away on a free kick.
Or really just kind of slamming it into the ground, really. It's
Yeah.
just, yeah.
So we come near the end. In the 82nd minute, Torocek fouls Americo Gallego and is sent off. Argentina's winner was before this sending off when Daniel Bertoni scores the winner. I imagine this was out of frustration, this foul, but in any case, it would have been his second bookable offense and he was sent off.
Hmm.
And we mentioned that Nirashi was already booked in the 21st minute. And just a minute before the end, he's also sent off after a foul on Mario Kempes. So you thought things couldn't get worse, but they're getting worse as in one instant they lost two of their biggest stars through
Yes.
suspensions, and effectively their World Cup was over. And
Yeah, I mean, this
yeah,
game is just such a I mean, it's such an epic game in so many ways. I'm sure we'll get to the aftermath and the obituaries after the World Cup has ended later, but I think one of the correctives for over interpreting this World Cup performance in a negative way of saying, wow, they're just clearly not good enough, and all these sorts of things that are indeed said in Hungary and elsewhere. I think this game is a possible corrective to that overly negative interpretation of the World Cup because they absolutely go toe to toe with Argentina in this match and they absolutely match them. There is in no sense whatsoever that Argentina is clearly superior in this game, and Hungary compete with them very effectively through this game. I mean, as you say, Hungary take the lead. Argentina rather somewhat fortuitously equalize 4 minutes later. As you say, Guido really just sort of fumbles the ball into the path of Luque. And you would think at that moment, okay, this is where Argentina impose themselves on this game, and Hungary's brief moment of superiority is extinguished, and not a bit of it. I mean, Hungary go right back to being extremely competitive. They make things very, very tight in the midfield, but this is not a low block, sort of everybody behind the ball performance either. Although they really strangle the Hungarian midfield, they make things very difficult for Ardiles. They make things very difficult for Valencia. But despite the fact that they're doing that very effectively, they're a threat going forward throughout the match. And I think at the very least, a fair assessment of this match is that it's an evenly fought match, that either team could have won this match. Hungary have a great chance in the 70th minute before, when it's still 1-1. Martos crosses for Nudge. Nudge has a free header about 6 yards out, puts it wide. And then Argentina get this goal with 7, 8 minutes to go, just have a few more minutes to hold out. But if you stop the match there in the 83rd minute, you would say, well, bad luck, fellas. You could have won this game if the chips had fallen a different way. You could have won this game. No question that would be true. But you've still got 2 games to go. And Hungary had very much gone into this game. And maybe this explains how well they played, despite all the things we've just said about the poor preparation, the psychological blow of the demolition at Wembley. The fact that they play so well in this game may be partly explained by the fact that their attitude going into it was that it was a bit of a free hit, in the sense that they're not expected to win this game, and anything they can get out of the game is a bonus. So that might have freed them up mentally, just to say, well, let's just go for it here. There's no point being timid, because if we get a draw, it's a huge bonus. If we lose, it's not the end of the world. And I think, as I say, if you stop the game at the point of that late winner, then they would have gone out of it saying, we played really well. We've got nothing to be afraid of here. We can go and beat Italy in the next game. But the sendings off completely changed the feeling of the match for Hungary, completely changed the narrative of the match. It goes from being a heroic defeat that would nevertheless give them confidence going into the next match. It goes from that to being a complete disaster, the sending off of these two players. And it is really a strange couple of sendings off. It's really hard to understand the sendings off. Now, it's not hard to understand the sendings off if you put this match into the present day. If you put this match into the present day, almost everybody gets sent off, because there's constant fouling of a nature that gets you a booking today. But in this
Yeah, at
game,
the time, it played into the narrative that everything was being made for Argentina to win this
yes,
World Cup.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely it was. And I don't want to cast any aspersions on Garrido, I think his name was, the Portuguese referee, because I've got no evidence, and I don't know of any evidence that he was corrupt in any way. I've got no reason to think of that he was, and I shouldn't accuse him of being so. I know that the Hungarian players felt that he was biased. Now, that's not necessarily evidence that he was, because players often think the referee is biased. But their impression certainly was that everything was going Argentina's way. I must say, it's not my impression watching the game, with the exception of these 2 sendings off. And the sendings off as I say, were really strange. If you watch the game, you think, oh, that's not a booking. Oh, that's not a booking. That's interesting. I would expect that to be a booking, especially if you look at it from with later eyes. There's some very violent play in this game. There's also constant fouling in the midfield on both sides. And then suddenly, when the game is almost over, he sends these 2 players off, the 2 most important attacking players in the Hungary team, in a way that cripples Hungary for the rest of the group. And it's interesting that it doesn't really affect the outcome of this game, because it happens so late. But so you say, well, how does that benefit Argentina? But it certainly benefits Argentina and Italy, in the sense that it really puts Hungary in a far weaker position for the rest of the group because of the suspension for the Italy game that ensues. I think the other thing I would want to say about the Tudicic part of it is his first booking, as you say, was sort of out of frustration. I think it was actually a throw-in that was given the other way, and he just slams the ball on the ground, but referee books him for dissent. Okay, fair enough. That's by the book. That is dissent. It should be a booking. Why is he so frustrated? I mean, he's a bit of a feisty player, Tudicic, but why is he so frustrated? Well, because that's about the 50th minute, because he feels that everything is going the other way. And a pretty good example of that, which doesn't get talked about enough, is that in the first half, I think it's Galvan comes in a situation where there's a bouncing ball and he goes in, studs first, chest height, and absolutely cleans out to the chick. Studs first. It's just a foul. And the referee does something. Not only does he just come over and give a foul and not a booking, you get a pretty good case for a red card for this. As I say, stud first in the chest is a pretty serious piece of violent play in many interpretations. He comes over, gives a free kick, doesn't book him, and actually tries to physically drag Tudicic up as if he's sort of pretending to be injured, which he certainly isn't. So Tulicic's level of frustration, I think, by the time he gets his first booking with the referee in particular is pretty high. And he's one of the players who goes on record afterwards for saying, well, he gave everything the other way in this game. And he was smiling about it, doing it. Again, I didn't see that personally, but they have a better view on events than I could have. The two fouls, particularly Tudicic's, you just can't. I would challenge your listeners to go and watch it and see if they can see a difference between these two fouls and the fouls that are happening throughout the second half. So it's just really hard to understand why these result in red cards. Again, I don't have any evidence of any kind of corruption, and I shouldn't accuse anybody of it if I don't, but it's just odd. It's just really strange. And again, it completely changes what this game represents for the rest of the World Cup. It turns it into a disaster, both practically in terms of the suspensions and psychologically.
Yeah, and the next match against Italy was no contest. So on June 6th, they face Italy at Mar del Plata. This is the Italy team. Many of the players would go on and win the 1982 World Cup. We have the likes of Captain Dinozof, Cabrini, Gentile, Scirea, Antonioni, Tardelli, Paolo Rossi, managed by the legendary Enzo Bearzot. This is a match where Roberto Bettega would hit the post 3 times. So for this match, we have the following lineup. We have a new goalkeeper. Ferenc Majaros starts in goal. The rest of the lineup, you have Kochis, Toth, Zombori, Kereki, Pinter, Martos, Japo, Neji, he'd replaced by Toth in the 46th minute. Fazekas, he'd be replaced by Halaj in the 46th minute, and Pushtai. Italy would win 3-1. Paolo Rossi scored in the 34th minute. 2 minutes later, Roberto Bettega scored. In the 60th minute, Romeo Benetti scored with a long range shot. And Hungary pulled one goal back through penalty kick in the 81st minute. Japo was fouled by Scirea, and the Toth scored from a penalty kick. So 2 matches, 2 losses. Hungary were out. This match was not even close for
Well, I,
Hungary.
I would say you're right that in the end it wasn't close. And as you say, Italy hit the woodwork 3 times. And you're certainly right that in the end it wasn't close. But I would say until the first Italian goal, which was 33rd, 34th minute, it's an even contest up until that point. So despite all of the things that we've said about the effect of this Argentina game, psychologically, the fact that it deprives Hungary of 2 of their best players, it also, by the way, deprived them of Turek. Turek was injured. He took a blow to the neck in the Argentina game. I think unintentional, but nevertheless, his neck was severely bruised. That's why he comes off at half time in that Argentina game. So there's 3 enforced changes to 3 of their better players. The new keeper is the only unenforced change from the first game. And this one I have to say is a little bit of a strange one, and I can only really explain it by the fact that Barotti by this time had at least two of his World Cups ruined by goalkeeping errors. I mean, Hungary go out of the 66 World Cup due to goalkeeping errors. Same in, did I say 62? 62 and 66, where he's the manager. Goalkeeping errors play a big part in Hungary's defeats. And you could say certainly that Guida was at fault for Argentina's first, but it was one of these situations where there's a free kick and the keeper was unsighted and he sees it at the last moment. He doesn't gather it. It wouldn't really be normally the basis for dropping a goalkeeper. You couldn't say that he had a bad game. So it's hard to explain that goalkeeping change other than sort of perhaps Borotti's paranoia about goalkeepers letting him down. And he reverses the change as we'll see later for the third game. But anyway, despite all of that, despite the fact that Hungary go into this second game at a disadvantage, you really wouldn't know if you look at the first half hour of the game that this would be a game that would turn out to be, as you say, one-sided. They're absolutely competitive. They have a great chance before Italy's first goal. Nudges clean through on goal and puts it over. Again, you could look at the parts of this game and say, the result is not a demonstration of Hungary being clearly an inferior team to Italy, even despite the way that it turns out. But because of the way it turns out, as you say, it's the end. That's it. They can't qualify now, and the dream is over.
And the last match in the group on June 10th, again at Mar del Plata, is against France. And both teams have already been eliminated. So it's an inconsequential match. Now, for this match, both teams arrive at the stadium with their away white kits for this
Yeah.
match. So I think for some reason it was okay for Hungary to keep their white kit or they had arranged it before. I don't exactly know.
The reason is that they realized that FIFA had sent a letter to the French team 2 or 3 days before, instructing them to wear their blue. So the French team, it turned out, were at fault, but their blue kit was back in Buenos Aires, so they had no way of getting it.
So instead, after 45 minutes, at which the referee even threatened to forfeit France, they were able to get the kits of the local club, Club Atletico Kimberley, which was a green and white vertical striped shirts.
Yeah.
So a strange sight to see the French national team with that kit, but it's part of a legend now of football. Yeah.
You think you're watching Saint Etienne play or something like that, I guess.
Yeah. So for this match on June 10th, we have the following lineup. Gujdar is back in the squad. Toth,
Hmm.
Zombori, Kereki, Nilashi, Pinter, Martos, Balint, Neji. He'd be replaced by Japo in the 73rd minute. Torochik is back and Pushtai. Now, this match, France takes the lead in the 22nd minute through Christian Lopez with a long range shot. Marc Berdol scored the second for France in the 37th minute. Zombori scores for Hungary in the 41st minute with a long range shot from the edge of the box after a combination play with Nilashi. And yeah, we should point out that both Torocic and Nilasi had served their suspension. They were back for this
Hmm.
match.
Hmm.
And just a minute later, France scored the third goal through Dominic Rosto. That's three matches for Hungary, three losses. All in all, a very disappointing preparation, controversial preparation.
Hmm.
Then what happens in the first match? It all went downhill from there.
It's funny about this third game is that in many ways, as you say, it's a meaningless game. And it's really hard. The players and managers will always say, no, 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 it's a big game, doesn't matter. But it's impossible, really, for players not to feel in some way that it's a meaningless game. However, the narrative of this World Cup for Hungary is so bound up in the three defeats that you can't help thinking that it would have made a difference had they won this game. Because the gloomy narrative that comes out of this World Cup would have been at least partly dispelled by a victory here. And from some people, this is in Hungary, this is the game that produces the most criticism. For example, the great Hungarian legend, Florian Albert, he goes on record saying this is the game he was the most angry about because he just felt that they didn't really put the full effort in to winning this game. And he particularly pinpoints Nilashian Tudicic, who come back in the team for this game, which is interesting that he highlights this as the most disappointing performance. But one thing just to add, what we might have mentioned before about Nilashi and Tudicic, what happens to them as a result of the sending off. Of course, they receive a one-match ban because these are two yellow cards, they're not a straight red. They receive that one-match ban, of course, from FIFA. But Kutash, the president of Hungarian FA, we've mentioned a few times, he wants to send them home immediately. And it's only the intervention of Borotti or the insistence of Borotti or the persuasion of Borotti that keeps them at the tournament. But the sort of the compromise punishment to the fact that they get to stay is they're both given very heavy fines and they're made to train separately from the rest of the group. So it's hardly surprising, is it, that they don't come into this third game and deliver the performances of their lives. It would be extraordinary to expect them to do so. So that they've really been hammered in response to this. I mean, and the public statements after sending off is all, yes, they behaved terribly. Yes, this was an awful mistake. And I don't know how you feel about this. On the one sense, it's nice to see managers not always making excuses for their players, because that's sometimes what managers do too much these days. But I think it goes too far the other way. And it's certainly the feeling of the players who were in that squad that the reaction was far too far the other way. That okay, they didn't go out and say no problem, they weren't in the wrong, but they really castigated them publicly and they very severely punished them privately.
Right.
And
And
this
in
left,
general, this sending off seemed a bit harsh when you
yeah,
look at it.
yeah.
So,
I completely agree. Yeah. So both of them have got, I think, reason to feel aggrieved in terms of the actual sending off. And then that's just compounded by this punishment. And then actually, this would probably be something to mention in a future 1982 discussion. But actually, when they get back home, they are banned from the national team as well for a while as a result of this. So the punishment is really over the top. And when you think, okay, this group, by the time of this third match, this group has been cooped up, rather strictly supervised for about 6 weeks, which is enough for anybody to get cabin fever. They've just had this huge disappointment. They're out of the World Cup. They're afraid about what the reaction is when they get back to Hungary, because in previous World Cups, there had been some previous World Cups, there'd been a very negative reaction to the team when they got back to Hungary. It's really a bit much to expect the team in this situation to pull out a remarkable performance. And the French team, despite the fact that they had lost their first two games, I think they don't have any of these problems. They play in a much freer way. Of course, the French goal that takes the lead is just a blast from the blue, about 30 yards out, that begins the dominoes falling. But I think no result in football is inevitable, but it's really hard to see a situation in which Hungary would have pulled out a really strong performance in this game.
shortly thereafter, Barotti is replaced as manager by Ferenc Kovács. Was it after this does he go to Benfica or was that before? Barotti
It was
eventually
after,
finds his
yeah,
way. Yeah, he eventually finds his
yeah.
way to Benfica.
Yeah. So just to say about Kovac, so Ferenc Kovac, who any listeners who listened to the Videoton discussion we had, he's the manager of the Videoton team, Ferenc Kovac, in that great run a few years later. He had been Barotti's assistant between 76 and 78 and at the World Cup. And the type of assistant where he's really doing most of the training. So when there's training sessions, it's really Kovac who's doing the coaching. A couple of things to mention, though, is that Barotti, remember, by this point, even though, as you say, he's going to go on and manage Benfica and win the double at Benfica in the near future, when he gets given the job of national team coach, it's a surprise in the sense that he was really at the end of his career by this point, and he'd already transitioned into this sort of FA role, head of coaching role, that really would indicate that he's not going to be on the bench anymore. He's not going to be the manager or coach of a team anymore. He comes back really in this emergency that emerges from Bojic's sickness to take on the job that was earmarked for Bojic. And he has no intention of going to the World Cup at all. He wants to get Hungary qualified and then step away and allow someone else to bed in and do the rest. The extra qualifying tie ruins that plan. So Hungary finishes their qualification campaign in May. So his idea was if I don't get them qualified, I'm sacked. That's clear. If I get them qualified, I can step away in May, and there's a year for a new manager to bed in before the World Cup and take them to Argentina. The extra playoff against Bolivia means the World Cup qualification is not secured until the end of November. And that's just deemed not enough time to introduce a new manager. So he doesn't want to go to even to Argentina, but sort of feels like he has to. Ferenc Kovac is his number two man. When they get back to Hungary, there's these penalties I mentioned against Turicic and Nyilasi. They're banned. Two other players are banned, including Zombori. I feel bad that we haven't mentioned Zombori specifically. Zombori was really the outstanding player for Hungary in this tournament. And in all three of the games, he was the best player on the Hungary team. Had a great tournament. He's a Russia player. He's also given a ban when they get back. So there's these four players, Nyilasi, Turicic, Tort, and Zombori, which are given bans by the FA.
Were the other two given bans?
That I don't know. I don't understand the other two. There's some sort of, with Zombori, there's some sort of unexplained disciplinary problem going on at the club. With Tort, I don't know. I don't know what's behind that one. And with Nyilashkin and Turicic, it's a further punishment for the sending off. But Kovac says, Barotti steps down, which was always his intention, as they didn't even want to go to Argentina. They say to Kutaj says to Kovac, all right, you're next, you're next in line, it's your job. Kovac says, I'm not going to do it because of the ban of these four players. I refuse. You shouldn't have banned these four players. And he's called into the FA and they tell him, you can take this job or you'll never coach in Hungary again. So he really takes an national team coaching job. And of course, we'll see he does a pretty good job with that because he's an excellent coach, but he takes it really under duress. He really is forced to take it against his will.
In closing, how is this World Cup participation regarded by Hungarian football historians, despite all the negativity?
Yeah, I mean, it should be regarded as a triumph because of the 12-year gap. The qualification was a real achievement. And there wasn't a huge expectation coming in, despite some of the statements that were made in the media. There wasn't a huge expectation of Hungary doing well in the actual tournament because this was the original group of death, I think, honestly. Nevertheless, because of the way things went, or everything that we've mentioned, the preparation, the Wembley game, the shoplifting, the 3 out of 3 defeats, the sendings off. It's really regarded as a catastrophe, honestly. When it's looked back on in Hungary, it's looked back on as a disaster. And as the Hungary team both being extremely unfortunate and being completely outplayed, which I think is a little bit unfair. I actually don't think that's quite accurate, but yeah, that's the view of it in Hungary is that this was a sort of a classic Hungarian catastrophe. I think that's unfair on the players. I think there's some fantastic players in this team who don't get to show themselves at their best for various reasons. But some of them prove in the next 4 years their quality. I mean, Fazakas is back again after his crisis. He's back in the next World Cup. He scores in the next World Cup at the age of 35 or 34. And both Tulicic and Yolashi are reinstated after their ban and go on and play important roles for Hungary in the coming years. The really unfortunate one, I think, is Vardy, who was one of the great players, misses this World Cup through injury, and then doesn't get to play in the 82 World Cup, and so never really gets to show his quality on the big stage. It's a team that I really do think it's a team that can count itself, unfortunately.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this series on Hungarian football.
A
All our
pleasure.
respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, David, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on Hungarian football history.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.